so glad to share that we have among us a very distinguished guest, a renowned writer, editor, content creator, and a journalist, Mr. Andre Borges. Andre, I am so glad to have you here, and I welcome you on behalf of the entire team of DUBeat.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited for this interview.
Yes. So before moving on to some serious questions, I want to ask something light. So we all know you from your Instagram feed, your BuzzFeed bio, but I really want to know something more about you, something exotic about your schooling, your undergraduation, college life, anything that is apart from something that we already know.
Okay. So something is a little different, right? Oh, okay. I am actually, so in my school days and in college and stuff, I played football a lot. So I was very into sports in that sense. But one of the things that I play a lot, which is a stress buster for me, it's also like it's just for me, it's a good night out, is I play snooker a lot, which a lot of people don't know. It's something that I've been playing since I was 15 years old. There's there's a pool hall in Bandra where I used to go very, very often. That's something I've been missing in the lockdown a lot, like to the point where I've downloaded a snooker game on my phone to kind of play. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's like the one thing I feel like won't change. Because I used to sing, I used to, I was a bit of an artist. I used to write way, way more than I do now. But snooker is something I feel like going into my 40s and 50s also, I'll probably still be playing the sport.
Yeah. Okay. So that was lovely to know. Now I'll begin with my question. So taking it up from the current political climate of our country, there are a lot of debates around what is good journalism, what is bad journalism. And I saw one of your posts which said that the pillar of journalism had fallen in our country. So in your opinion and in your definition, what is good journalism? And are there any names that you associate with good journalism or good journalists as per?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of names I would associate. The very obvious one is Faye D'Souza, who's doing a pretty stellar job on her own through, kind of independent journalism. Ravish Kumar is great. I really, really like his stuff. For the most part, organizations, and I know this is going to be controversial, like organizations like The Wire and Scroll are doing really, really good journalists. They have some great, great reporters in their stead. I think there's a confusion about why people often cite, say, organizations like The Wire and Scroll and stuff like that is good journalists, and I'll explain why I think so. Not to say that there aren't stellar journalists in NDTV or India Today or in all of the mainstream organizations. There are great journalists. I don't think the organizations as a whole are doing good journalism, but there are great reporters, great journalists. Well, one such instance would be News Laundry. News Laundry is doing fantastic. I mean, it's appalling that not many people kind of follow the news that they've been doing, because they've been covering almost every big story in India relentlessly and very, very well on the ground reports. I think when I say there is no more good journalism in India, it's because journalism, one, has to be unbiased. It has to be reporting the facts and has to this thing. But with the internet age, I understand my journalism itself holds various opinions and various, I would say, inherent bias that every good journalist tries to eradicate. But I think in the tumultuous time that is India in 2020, the main issue is the organizations, the news organizations, and the journalists who are constantly reporting what the ruling government wants you to report. And I think the basis for good journalism in India, even though it's such a low bar, I would say is reporting things that mainstream media is not covering because of their affiliations or allegiance or agendas with the ruling party. And in times where so many people are suffering in India, I think the only place to lean into is anti-establishment. Now, when I say anti-establishment, lots of organizations during the rule of the Congress also were anti-establishment, which is fine. I think that it is the power and the responsibility of the media to question the establishment. That is
Correct.
the whole, it's
Yeah.
one of the factors and basics of good journalism, where you do not specifically report about things that are happening, but also question why those things are happening, how are these things happening, who benefits from these things happening. And I think the government as a whole, in my opinion, you can say the best thing about them, but it doesn't outweigh at all, doesn't outweigh the bad that they've done in the last few years since 2014. So yeah, I do think journalism has fallen in India, and I think it's going to be a really long time before we climb back up to being able to call ourselves a free press country.
Okay. Yeah. I also want to ask a follow-up to that. Do you really believe that the lines that separate a political critic, be it the critic of a government or anything, a critic and a journalist? Because in my opinion, criticism and journalism, in my opinion, should be different things. But as you said, we live in ages where a journalist has to speak or has to criticize. So how do you look at this? Criticism versus journalism?
I mean, it's very distinct features of critics. So I wouldn't call social or social or psychological commentary about a specific aspect of what is being reported in the news as journalism as such. I think when you call us organization, a journalistic organization, one, they fall under legacy media, they fall under news broadcasting standards, they fall under a bunch of affiliates with the government. But the difference between a person being a critic and a person being a journalist is how they're reporting, how properly they're vetting their sources, how properly they're verifying the news, how much do they speak to the on the ground people. I recently saw, I think it was a Scoop Whoop video where one of their reporters had kind of gone into the farmer protests and
I saw that too. Yeah.
I can't remember the guy's name, Sambhav, I want to say. Sambhav, something like that. I
saw that too.
Sorry to him. Yeah, but I think he's doing better journalism about the farmer protests than any of the other organizations, because the easiest and the most basic aspect of covering a story like that is to go and talk to the farmers, and a lot of organizations just aren't doing that. So I think that I think there is the line is becoming thinner and thinner, but there is still a line between being a social critic versus being a journalist. I think how most Indians recognize journalism, I guess, is through affiliations with organizations like Press Club of India and the OPC and basically, yeah. So I often get asked, like, how are you a journalist? You work for BuzzFeed and this and that. And my retort to that is always, I was a journalist long before I joined BuzzFeed, and I was a journalist throughout my time at BuzzFeed, and I am henceforth, even though I'm not tied to an organization, a news organization currently. So yeah, I think there are fine lines. You can also argue that a lot of critics, a lot of social commentators, Dhruv Rathi, all of these guys who do a lot of what is in essence journalistic work, could also be considered journalists. I don't know. Like, say for instance, John Oliver. John Oliver is considered by most people a journalist, except himself. He keeps saying, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a part of the journalistic fraternity. But in my opinion, yeah, sure. His news show, his news talk show puts him more in line with journalistic ethics than most like Fox News. I don't consider it journalism at all, but I consider John Oliver a journalist. So
yeah. Andrea, I want to ask that there are a lot of people I myself have seen who say that an entire media house should be boycotted or should get shut down just because one person whom you identify with that media house is propagating false news or is propagating a particular political agenda. Now, one can look at it from a very different perspective also, because there are a lot of people who run a big media house. There are cameramen, there are people from technical staff who have nothing to do with the political vendetta of that person we see on television, without naming anyone.
Right.
So do you think, is it correct to associate just one person with an entire media house and then boycott it?
in my opinion, if you're talking specifically about the media house in question, Republic, the person associated as being the face of that company or being the captain at the helm of that company is also the owner of that company. So that it in itself is a problem. Like, say for instance, if we're talking about Times Now or even The Wire or something like that, where there are specific personalities attached to those media houses, and you associate them with fake news from whichever side of the spectrum, political spectrum you're from. Because a lot of people from the right wing will claim that Wire is fake news, or Scroll is fake news, or I am fake news, or whatever. Which personally I don't have a problem with, but I'm just saying, you can't isolate a person and then boycott the entire. I agree with your point completely. It is hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands of jobs associated with that specific this thing, but it all depends on whether it's misinformation or it's hate speech, and it's a very clear political and communal agenda coming from the who I'm assuming your viewers also will understand is the publication in question, because there is a lot of evidence to support that their fact-based analysis of topics and stuff like that align clearly with the government's agenda and clearly with kind of their assumption of one community being kind of subjugated, so to speak. So I think there's a large difference between a bad news organization, kind of not vetting sources properly, spreading misinformation and stuff like that, and massive hate speech. So I think an analogy.
Okay.
Personally, I don't really adhere to the fact of boycotting an entire production, say like a film or a television show, when one of their cast members is called out for whatever it is. And I do agree that the cast member itself or the director, or creator, producer, whatever it is, should be held accountable for their actions. Like, I really like what Netflix did, where Kevin Spacey was called out. He was immediately fired from the show, but the show itself didn't get taken down, or it didn't get this thing, because there, in that essence, you have a ton of people who are working to create the best product possible, but had nothing to do with his crimes. That's not the same thing as being someone who's propagating hate speech, as being the face of that channel or being the owner of that channel, because everyone involved in that, the writers, the producers, the editors, everyone involved in that, it's come to a point where it's not just a job. You can literally see people being beaten and killed on the streets. So at some point,
I just want to ask that you mentioned misinformation and hate speech. Although it's very wrong to compare both, okay, in terms of the degree of the degree of evilness that's there. But what do you consider to be a greater crime? Misinformation or hate speech?
Hate speech. Hate speech 100%. Yeah. Hate speech 100%. So I mean, hate speech can fall under misinformation. It can fall as a subset of that, but misinformation doesn't necessarily have to be hate speech. Misinformation could just be and I've seen this. I've been in newsrooms where reporters want to rush to a story because at that time it was like first one to break the story is like, you get a lot of recognition for breaking the story first. And I've seen I myself also have been shooting the gun and kind of just like jumping the gun of sorts and trying to report trying to report something that like we didn't have all the facts. So I can understand why there's misinformation in terms of like bad reporting or kind of jumbling the sources together and stuff like that. But hate speech is very clearly hate speech. It's like you mentioned earlier, right? Like journalism at its core is reporting and informing and spreading awareness, right? And the opinion is added by the personality who is reporting said news. So when hate speech is communicated, that personality takes over way more than the actual news being reported, because those opinions form the crux of what the specific story is, and then it flows into what the story is.
Also, Andre, I just saw your tweet, I think 1 day or 2 days, you mentioned about Mumbai Mirror, Pune Mirror getting shut down and Mumbai Mirror going weekly. And you also mentioned that you did your internship, you began your journalism career from there. So this shutting down specifically of Mumbai Mirror, or other print houses. How do you look at it? Is it just print going out of fashion, or it has more to do with good media houses not getting funds?
Contextually different for different cases, I suppose. With the Mumbai Mirror thing, from what I've understood and read, is they cost more than what they were bringing into the company, which all businesses are businesses, like at the end of the day. So I understand if the Times Group feels like it's not really a strong enough endeavor bringing in money. And I feel like in general, journalism across the world is suffering. Whether it be TRPs, whether it be advertising, whether it be subscription models. If we live in 2020, where a tweet can go more viral than an article or a video that takes a lot of money and effort to produce.
Yes.
So freelancers are more sought after than full-time members. So it all honestly depends. If we're talking about media houses suffering in general, like HuffPo India was shut down, and that to me is in the context of why it couldn't be shut down. Why it couldn't sustain, due to the the FDI guidelines and whatever, and the new guidelines don't allow for 27% more to be owned by. So I again, rationally, I understand it. Emotionally, I think it's a huge loss to India, because not only were they doing great stories for politics, but say Ankur Pathak was doing great stories for Bollywood and culture. He was one of the guys who always broke stuff around the Me Too cases. He also had phenomenal interviews where he was one of those guys I feel didn't really let up just because he was a big star, or he didn't have fluff questions and stuff. He really broke down the meat of who that person was, and was again, this is just my random opinion, but it's not random, it's a very I feel well-informed opinion, but slowly we're losing our grasp of everything that would inform the viewer, or everything that would inform the individual citizen about anything, whether it's because foreign media has no affiliation to the government, right? They don't care about whether it's whatever, which can't be said for legacy media anymore. And it's the same with the OTT platforms, right? Like kind of Netflix or Prime or even Hotstar, any of these places making shows that don't really fit within what Bollywood has set up as the cultural norms for India, right? And I mean, people are boycotting Netflix for what? Kissing in front of a temple, or like random things. And I understand if it affects the sentiments of certain groups or certain this thing, but it's not like Bollywood has not done that, nor has it been that India's history is so prudish that the temples have sex carvings, and we invented the Kama Sutra. Like it doesn't make sense to me. So my only indication is that these are small ways to tackle different avenues, and I think the government, for what it's worth, is very smart. And I'm not even joking about this, we'll be North Korea, or we'll be China, or we'll be cut off from the outside world, where no one hears about what's happening in India, and the people of India also don't really understand what's kind of happening with their fellow citizens.
So you mentioned about this suppression. I want to ask, how is regressive state apparatus working today? Because things are quite apparent to us, but at the same time, they're not so apparent also. I mean, regressive state apparatus is working in very shadowy lines. For example, the HuffPost, the shutting down of HuffPost India. It looked very nice on the face of it, because that there was a particular bar on foreign direct investment, 27%. It looked very nice. It seemed very lawful and constitutional. But don't you think that things are very apparent to us, but they're not so apparent also? And perhaps that is why we don't have enough proof to raise our voices. I mean, how do you look at it? How do you look at the regressive state apparatus today?
So, I look at it in three ways. Okay. One, when you say us, you imply the privileged lot. Yes, it is very apparent to you and I, or anyone watching this broadcast, or anyone on Twitter, or anyone on Instagram. But that's a very small part of the population. So for the majority of the population, they're watching TV news. And from the context of TV news, it seems like, Modi and the Modi government itself is doing a phenomenal job, which is backed up by actual sources in terms of like foreign trade and foreign relations and stuff like that. But saying Modi has created great foreign relations, we've always had good foreign relations. When have we not relations? So, I mean, Modi's traveling more. That's about it. Like, he's just going to different countries. So I think what majority, 90% of the population are seeing is what the government wants you to see through the TRPs and through the broadcasts of these television journalists. The second thing is, like, for instance, there have been two huge understandings that the country is not happy with the current government. One is the CAA, and now it's the farmer protests. But look at how it's being reported, and look at how it's being. It was no one understands the CAA, and Muslims are terrorists. For the farmer protests, it's no one understands the farmer bills, and farmers are terrorists. So you can see the narrative being built. Very honestly, it's not like I personally don't think they're doing it in a shadowy conspiracy way. Like, it's not one of those governments that's like, it's not the Bush administration, or it's not being done in secret. I feel like they're extremely open about it, and they don't care. Like, they have literally tweeted out, like, Amit Shah has literally said the words, like, I want this to be a Hindu nation. Anyone else will kind of just, like, whatever. I'm not speaking verbatim, but I'm just saying, to the context of his tweet, he wants it to be a very Hindus that live here have to be okay with that. Which, as a citizen of India, as a constitutionally abiding citizen of India, you should be mad about that. Over the last, like, 5 years, 6 years, they've said lots of things and backtracked immediately. It's with the CAA, if you look at it with the NRC, they said they're going to do it. Then Modi said, no, we're not going to do it. Then Amit Shah would go on another podium and say, yes, we are doing it countrywide. Then the government would be like, no, we're thinking about it. So I don't think they're doing anything in secret. I think they're very smart about what they're doing. They're cutting time for people to kind of gauge and understand what exactly is happening. I mean, India has fallen by many slots on the freedom of the press index. We had 146, 147 or something like that, behind countries which have, ostensibly never had freedom of the press. So, like, whenever the UN, or say, the Washington Post or New York Times or someone writes an article about us, it's always contested by the state leaders, or it's contested by the government, and cases are filed against reporters in the states and stuff. So, like, what is the solution? The only solution in my eyes is to vote them out of power, and that cannot happen through a general election. It has to happen through local, state, and district elections. Like, it has to happen at very, very minute levels, where they lose their power in parliament itself, which now, from yesterday's news, I think they are increasing the number of seats in the Lok Sabha from 500 and something to 800 and something, which I haven't really read much about it, but, like, I don't even know if that's legal. Like, can you really do that?
Yeah, so this brings me to my, related question only. You mentioned that there's a lot of confusion, to be very honest, in the country, and no one knows what's happening. We know what's happening, but then again, we don't know what's happening, or, people are being misinformed, the public is being misinformed. There are a lot of confusions. So taking it up from the farmer protests only, now protests are happening.
Yeah.
You mentioned CA and you mentioned the farmers protest. Now, the kind of pattern that we have seen is that not a big heed is paid to whatever that's happening. I mean, the incumbent, or I would say the people in power, don't really pay heed to what's happening. So in this scenario, considering also how various levels of government and various organs of government, including judiciary as a last resort, has somehow failed us. So who should the common people then look to? And how do you think this fascism is going to end?
It's the question of the day. Like, if not these people, then who? Like, you can't rely on the cops, you can't rely on the elected officials, you can't rely on the judiciary. I mean, the Supreme Court did show some shine in the middle. Like, they did give some great landmark judgments. They cleared a lot of things. And then, I mean, I guess it all depends on who's the sitting judge at that specific time. The Supreme Court is supposed to be the last bastion of democracy. It's supposed to be they're supposed to be absolutely unbiased. They're supposed to be absolutely for the people of India. And personally, for me, I have not seen that over the last few years. I don't think they are for or at least what they should be in terms of for the people of India. When it comes to protest, over the last few years, these two in specific, and with the farmer protests, I've only been amplifying and just kind of spreading the word and stuff. But the CAA, I was way more involved in terms of like helping with the organization of protests, helping with the funds dispersed to the organization committees and some of the communities. So I can very honestly say that the government definitely took notice. They rolled back the NRC for a while, which was huge. I mean, the CAA was already passed, so it was already a law, so you couldn't really do much about that. But it doesn't work unless you have the NRC in tandem. So it's just a one-part thing, then it's fine. It was unfortunate that COVID happened. So the entire protest and all of it had to kind of stop for safety's sake. In my lifetime, have never seen a protest hold so much momentum for such a long time.
Yeah.
Whether it be online or whether it be on the ground protests. I'm saying in my lifetime because, I mean, I'm sure our fathers and grandfathers would have seen more protests than we did in the farmer protests. I mean, they had to lock up Delhi. they couldn't. I don't think that. I think that this is where they're failing. When these protests and the actual citizens rise up, they don't know how to handle that. They can deal with journalists and activists and Twitter commentaries. They'll slap sedition cases, the UAPA. They'll throw some people in jail. They'll file cases against us. But when the actual citizens, when there are 1 lakh, 2 lakh, 3 lakh, 4 lakh citizens rising up, coming and marching to the capital of the country, it's ridiculous in my brain that they would even attempt to throw water cannons and tear gas. And it's such a whirlwind of a story that the farmer protest has been happening for years. It happened in 2018. It happened when these new farm bills were passed. Farmers from different states have been protesting for months, and very trickles of news were coming in. I think even I posted about it a couple of times, and then it kind of went to the back burner in terms of other things happening across the country. But the situation in Delhi that happened, it's on everyone's TV screens now. It's on everyone's news feeds. So I think the government is slowly starting to lose that control, and it's beautiful to see, because when you ask about how do we end this fascist regime, it's voting them out of power for sure. I'm telling you, when you vote them out of power, everything else will fall in line. Right?
About when you say that people are going to vote them out of power, because I also
no, I'm not. I'm not sure. That's my main plea to everyone watching this, or everyone.
Okay.
I'm not saying don't vote for whoever you think is the best candidate, but there is no possible way that you can think they are the best candidate. They're very, very US, right? There was 4 years of Trump where the US fell from being the superpower that it was, right? I didn't even want to go to the US. I mean, not that I probably couldn't have gone to the US also during that time, but I'm just saying I didn't really want to go to the US during Trump's rule. And my opinion of Biden and Harris is not that they are, I mean, I think they're great. I don't know if they're the best people to be leading the US, right? But they're definitely the better people to be leading the country. So this whole voting the BJP out of power, the first question that comes to mind is why will we vote Congress back in Congress? So they did so much of, shit back in the day and stuff like that. And I'm like, sure, I'm not saying the Congress are better. I'm not saying that they are the leaders that India should have. Rahul Gandhi, I'm not saying is the prime minister that everyone should aspire to, but I'm saying they are 100% better.
You mentioned OTT platforms. Now, my main main question regarding OTT platforms is that a lot of such shows that are coming up, they are definitely out of the box for, say, Sacred Games, who has to mention, because that was the first time that, Indian television or, this Indian OTT platform got reflected on the world stage. So these were the statements that people were giving, that Sacred Games was just, just brilliant. But my main question is that, is depiction of violence and extremism that these OTT shows are doing, do we really need some sort of censorship on the kind of content that is being portrayed? But then again, it becomes very paradoxical, because at one point we are saying that, OTT, any type of content should be away from censure, but then we also have to control extreme forms of violence that are being depicted. I mean, how do you look at it?
So, okay, I'll explain. So, the OTT platforms right now, uh, they have, they don't have any kind of censorship. They have what is called a self-regulatory censorship, which is basically they curb their own content in terms of how they want to present it to this thing. Say, for instance, I think uh, a, a show kind of showing, like, let's talk about India specifically. So a show talking about communal violence or talking about historical you know instances or whatever it is, it has to be shown in the right context in terms of you're not promoting that kind of thing happening, but you're only explaining that it did happen,
Yeah.
but you're also showcasing in the show that it's not the right way for it to be.
Yes.
What happens is, see, here's the difference between, say, films being regulated versus OTT platforms. And the new OTT rules, they don't only fall under OTT rules, they fall under news websites, they fall for I'm they've been very vague about what these new broadcasting standards will be for, let's just call it the internet. But they could be broadcasting standards that fall, like, say, for instance, I'm a content creator, right? I'm a content creator, verified profile on whatever, Instagram, Twitter. They could fall for me also. So it all depends on what kind of content they're trying to curb. And the language of this law, or the language of this, these guidelines are going to be very vague, such to the case where a lot of things will get stuck at the legal level, or will get stuck at, basically before production kind of happens. When you censor films, or when you censor Bollywood movies or Indian cinema in general, that is because you're censoring it for the general public who go to theaters to see a specific film. Now, if I'm sitting in the comfort of my own home and I want to watch something, I'm taking the active choice of clicking on that thing. I am taking the active choice of buying the subscription and watching that thing in its full, this thing. I think when you talk about certain, let's say, warnings or something like that about violence and depiction and stuff like that, there can always be disclaimers, there can always be trigger warnings, there can always be warnings, graphic content ahead or whatever it is. There are child locks on most of the OTT platforms, so that younger audiences aren't, they can't access it or whatever. um, for me, I don't think gratuitous violence, or is something is can be used as a reasoning for creating what is essentially broadcast guidelines for OTT platforms and
I
whatever
get you.
news web. So where do they stop? Does it stop with YouTube? Does it stop with content creators? Does it stop with memes? What? How are they going to regulate the internet? And
Okay. You mentioned in the beginning about, independent journalists like Fair D'Souza and Rana Ayub and, all such people. So going independent has somewhat become a trend these days, be it the content creators or journalists themselves. I mean, a lot of people, in fact, these are the people I would say who are actually doing brilliantly. I mean, doing brilliantly well. So how do you look at this trend?
From the conversations I've had with a lot of people, it also falls in line with, and again, this is a form of privilege, right? Like, it's very privileged to kind of quit your job and be able to make it on your own and stuff like that.
Yes.
Which a lot of us who kind of do that, we hold that privilege. For a lot of people who are reporters with companies they might not align with or want to be with, again, talking about companies that spread misinformation rather than hate speech, there's a distinction. They might not be able to do that. So I think it's a larger trend with a lot of the big names in news and politics and stuff like that, starting their own ventures and stuff. It's a I don't think it's a trend as such. It's a natural course of things, right? And I do agree there is some percentage of people for sure who have quit journalism because they do not believe in the essence of the industry anymore. The second thing is, it's very obvious. Social media kind of allows you to do that, right? Like, you can shoot an entire news segment in your living room, and it'll give you hundreds and thousands of views, which eventually can be monetized. You can talk about for independent journalists is that they seem to be covering more and more stories,
True.
one, that matter, and two, that they themselves have the knowledge and the experience.
I believe that certain media houses are more privileged than others in terms of capital and money. Now, there may be various reasons why they are so, but what I really want to ask is how commercial interests and capitalist interests drive journalism. Because when you are creating a whole lot of furore around how government is censoring journalism, you also need to look at within the organization how journalism is being censored by people who are investing their financial stakes in it. So how do you look at it? I mean, how do commercial interests drive journalism?
I mean, it happens. There's no two ways to look at it. It happens for sure. Yeah, capitalist. We live in a fairly capitalist society, so I won't say it happens to a point of like it being illegal, or I would say it's more of a gray area in terms of like stuff like that, and it's on the onus of who the person in charge of that newsroom is. So the editor-in-chief, or the head of the department, or whatever is running that specific cell, which would have been asked to either kill a story or drop a story, or report on. I don't think it's I don't think you can make a blanket statement about it, but it 100% happens.
Okay. Andrew, you have worked as a writer, an editor, a content creator, and then a journalist. Now, among all these professions, wherein did you feel that you had to, withhold yourself from expressing something, or where you felt that, oh, if I say this, I'm going to put myself into a lot of trouble? Though I shouldn't be asking this question, because this is very apparent that you're very vocal about everything, but still, I mean,
I honestly don't think I've ever felt that. Like, I've been, again, this is where privilege falls in, right? Like, I think that I've been very privileged to work with organizations that didn't ask me to either muzzle my thoughts as an individual or muzzle my thoughts within the company itself. Obviously, there's back and forth about how to present an idea or something like that. But with BuzzFeed and with my current company, Pocket Aces, I don't think I've ever had a situation where I've been told specifically, no, we cannot do this thing, or we can. And even when I was a reporter, at DNA, and when I was working with with Z and stuff like that, I never really had any kind of reining in of who I was and how I am.
So you completed your master's in English literature from Mumbai University. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm also
no, that's right.
A student only. Yeah. And I wanted to ask, I saw this.
Nice.
Yeah. I saw this post on Instagram. And again, I watched your videos on BuzzFeed. I think most of them were about Harry Potter, which seems to be your favorite book, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. So I want to ask, how do you look at literature as an art? Do you separate art from its artist, or, if you take it in the more technical terms, death of the author, which we have studied? Because I saw this post in which you wished Harry Potter happy birthday, but then there was this whole lot of controversy around, J.K. Rowling's statement. So how do you look at art? Do you separate the artist from the art, or how do you look at it?
I mean, actually, in this post is a good example, because I wished Harry Potter happy birthday, and I said, but not J.K. Rowling, because of obvious reasons. So I think, I don't know, it's a little difficult for me right now, because I'm realizing that almost all my childhood heroes are problematic. And everyone I kind of admire right now, really hoping there's nothing about Donald Glover, because I wouldn't be able to do. I just think it's a very complicated subject, and I feel like a lot of people will have certain feelings about this, right? Like, for instance, let's talk about Harry Potter, right? J.K. Rowling is extremely problematic, and I, for one, was an avid follower of hers, and I'm not anymore. I don't think I would ever read anything that she writes henceforth. But I can't separate my attachment to Harry Potter. I just can't. It was such a childhood escape for me. Like, I read all the books. I had traditions with my friends. So something that most people don't know is the movies used to release around the time of my birthday. So it was 18th, 19th, 20th. My birthday is on the 19th of November. So they used to release around the same time. So I had a tradition with a couple of my friends where we would always go first day, first show. A lot of times that was how I celebrated. That was the first thing I did on my birthday, was to go and watch a Harry Potter film. Cancel culture has gotten.
Yeah, exactly.
it's a subject that needs a lot more introspection and understanding. I feel you can revere a person's work, but like exonerating that person because of the work might be wrong. Like you can say Harry Potter is a great thing, but to say that we let things that J.K. Rowling slide because she created such a great thing is wrong.
So my last question is basically, regarding how students, especially aspiring journalists, they should approach this career because they have a lot of fear in their mind, especially, when it comes to like things like journalism is not safe in India, or, this career has no scope. So they are quite disillusioned about it. So any sort of ending note that or a message that you want to convey to them?
So, I mean, honestly, when I started, writing and stuff, I was writing when I was in high school, I think, around 14, 15 years old. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Like it was something that always spoke to me. I always had to put pen to paper. And that has kind of transitioned over the years, right? Like I'm still what you would call a writer, because like I write all the scripts for all my videos. I write, all the videos that I put on Instagram and stuff like that, they're written by me. So my obsession is making a great video, like making sure that the graphics are fine, making sure that the cutaways are there, making sure that the explanation in the video, in these explainer videos, translates well enough for the person to understand in an easy manner. So I mean, what I would like to say is like, yes, you are right. Journalism is very unsafe currently in the country, not specifically from physical harm, not isolated to physical harm, but also due to threats or legal ramifications. And the smaller part, but in no way less, problematic, is the hate and the abuse you get. It really hits your mental health. It's quite a problem. But but that being said, like it's not something I can stop doing. Like journalism or writing in general is not something that I can just I can't switch it off. Like I just have to. There are a lot of times where I'm sitting and I'm debating, okay, should I just share this news article, or should I just write up a tweet and stuff? And my friends have told me lots of times, like, tell na, it's fine, you don't have to, but it's a compulsion, I can't. So I think that's specifically how I see your career. Like if you want to pave a path in journalism, if you want to pave a path in breaking into this industry, you have to really feel it. You have to feel that kind of compulsion. It's not just that you like journalism or you're interested in it. Those are obviously big parts of it, but it's also that you kind of go to bed and you're thinking of like, okay, this is a story that I can definitely do. Okay, this is an angle I can cover.
So this is the end to the interview, and I'm sure this is going to be very insightful, and I only want to wish you all the best for your future. And
Thanks. I wish you the same, and I hope that you guys like that last part was a really good question, honestly, and I hope that it helps people kind of understand why they want to get into this field.
yes, thank you so much.